My mother sold me to the lottery for 300 thrones and a promise that she would not be reported to the Arbits for stealing water rations from the communal reclamation tanks. And I remember thinking, as the recruitment servitor tattooed the House Voltron sigil onto my forearm, that at least someone in our family had finally made a good deal. The tattoo hurt more than I expected, the needles driving black ink deep into the flesh until it felt like my arm had been dipped in acid, but the servitor's optical sensors never blinked, never showed anything that might have been mistaken for sympathy or recognitions that the thing beneath its needles was something other than meat that needed marking. When it finished, it released my arm with a mechanical whir that sounded almost disappointed, as if it had hoped for more resistance, more evidence of suffering to catalogue in whatever passed for its memory banks. 300 thrones. That was my value to the woman who had birthed me into the toxic recycled air of Hive Tertius's middle levels, who had fed me corpse starch for 16 years and taught me to read the shift schedules on the manufactorum walls, so I would know when to sleep and when to work. 300 thrones and the mercy of official blindness to her small crimes against the water laws. I did not blame her, not then and not now, because I understood even then that survival in the middle hive required calculations that had nothing to do with love or duty or any of the other abstractions that the preachers spoke about during mandatory devotional assemblies. She had 4 other children to feed, all younger than me, all still small enough to slip through the maintenance ducts and steal copper wire from the lower-level power conduits. I was becoming too large for that work, too slow, too visible to the roving patrols of Arbites who enforced the endless regulations that governed every breath and step in the hive. The lottery was a gift, they told us, a chance for the faithful to serve the Emperor's chosen nobility directly, to live in the spires where the air was clean and the light came from real lumen fixtures instead of chemical glow sticks that made your eyes burn after 12-hour shifts. They never mentioned what specific service the lottery winners would perform, and none of us asked, because asking questions was the kind of habit that got you marked for re-education or worse. The transport to the spire took 6 hours. 6 hours of sitting in a cargo hauler with 15 other lottery winners, all of us wearing the same gray jumpsuits marked with the Valdrin crest, all of us smelling of industrial solvents and fear and something else I could not name but recognized anyway as the scent of people who had just severed their last connections to anything that might have been called home. Nobody spoke during the ride. Not because we were forbidden to speak, but because what was there to say that would not sound like either self-pity or desperate hope, both of which felt equally pointless in the face of what was coming. I counted the others without appearing to stare directly at any of them, cataloguing faces and body types the way you learn to do in the manufactorums, where knowing who was strong enough to help with heavy lifts and who was likely to collapse from exhaustion could mean the difference between making quota and getting flogged by the shift supervisor. There were more men than women, most of us between 15 and 25 standard years, all of us lean in the way that comes from never quite eating enough but working constantly. Our hands marked with the scars and calluses of industrial labor. One woman, perhaps 30 years old, had a servitor's augmetic replacing her left hand, a crude mechanical claw that marked her as someone who had already survived at least one workplace accident serious enough to require mechanical intervention. Another man, younger than me by perhaps 2 years, had the finger code tattoos of a wire thief on his knuckles, marks that would have earned him immediate arrest in the lower hives, but up here, moving toward the spires, seemed as irrelevant as everything else we had been before the lottery. The hauler's viewport showed nothing during the ascent, just the gray metal of the transportation shaft walls sliding past at speeds that made my stomach clench with something between nausea and vertigo. But I could feel the change in air pressure as we rose through the hive levels, feel the way the stale, recycled atmosphere that had filled my lungs for 16 years gradually gave way to something cleaner, lighter, almost painfully pure. By the time we reached the upper levels, The air tasted of things I had no names for, chemicals and perfumes and the processed scents that the nobility used to mask the reality of living in a world where billions of humans generated waste and heat and need in quantities that strained even the vast infrastructure of imperial engineering. The cargo hauler came to rest with a pneumatic hiss that made several of us jump, our nerves raw and overloaded from hours of silent anticipation, and the rear door opened to reveal a loading bay that was larger than the entire hab unit my family had occupied in the middle hive. The walls were not the rusted metal and cracked rockcrete I had known all my life, but smooth white plasteel that glowed with embedded lumen strips, giving everything a soft, even light that made no shadows and seemed to come from everywhere at once. Servitors moved through the space with mechanical precision, their movements coordinated by programming I could not begin to comprehend, carrying crates and equipment with the blank efficiency of machines that had long ago forgotten they had once been human. A man was waiting for us at the bottom of the hauler's ramp, a man whose appearance made me understand immediately that everything I had thought I knew about human beings was going to need revision. He was not merely well-fed, he was maintained in a way that suggested resources beyond anything I could calculate. His skin smooth and unblemished, his hair perfectly arranged in the style I'd seen only in propaganda. Images of planetary governors and high ecclesiarchy officials. But it was his clothes that truly marked the distance between his existence and mine, robes of some fabric that shifted colors in the light, blues and greens and purples that seemed to flow like water, decorated with embroidery so fine that it must have taken months of labor to create the patterns that covered every centimeter of visible cloth. He looked at us the way you might look at a delivery of supplies, his eyes moving across our faces with professional assessment that catalogued and dismissed us in the space of perhaps 3 seconds. "I am Overseer Tallinn," he said, his voice carrying the educated accent of the upper hive, each word precisely formed in the manner of someone who has never needed to shout to be heard over machinery or crowd noise. "You have been selected by House Valdrin to serve in a specialized capacity that requires specific qualities, disposability, physical resilience, and a lack of significant external connections that would complicate your loss. You should understand immediately that the position you are about to undertake has a mortality rate of approximately 93% within the first 6 standard months. Those who survive longer typically do so by developing a combination of paranoia, quick reflexes, and an acceptance of the inevitability of painful death that borders on religious fatalism. You will be beast keepers for House Valdrin's exotic specimen collection, maintaining and caring for creatures that range from merely deadly to actively apocalyptic in their potential for destruction. Most of you will die in this service. Those who do not die will wish they had. There will be no resignation, no retirement, no transfer to other duties. You will serve until you are killed, at which point your remains will be processed into servitor components if they are sufficiently intact, or disposed of in the plasma furnaces if they are not. Are there any questions?" The silence that followed this announcement was so complete that I could hear the distant hum of ventilation systems, the soft tick of cooling metal in the cargo hauler behind us, the breath of the woman next to me catching in her throat in a way that suggested she had just fully comprehended what the lottery had actually won for her. Nobody raised a hand, nobody spoke, because what question could possibly matter in the face of what he had just told us? We had been brought here to die, our deaths planned and budgeted into whatever calculus the nobility used to justify their collection of creatures that should not exist anywhere near human habitation. The only variable was how long we would last, how much pain we would experience, whether our deaths would serve as entertainment or merely as cautionary examples to whoever replaced us. "Excellent," Overseer Tallinn said, his tone suggesting genuine satisfaction with our silence. "Your training begins now. Follow me and try not to touch anything. Several of you will die during the orientation process, and I would prefer to minimize casualties before you have at least seen what you are here to tend." The replacement lottery is not scheduled for another 3 months, and we are already understaffed following an incident involving a barking toad and a minor containment failure that resulted in the loss of our 3 most experienced keepers. Their bodies were never recovered, though certain chemical traces suggest they achieved molecular dissolution within approximately 90 seconds of exposure to the toxin cloud. A new record, actually. The previous fastest death took nearly 2 minutes. He turned and walked toward a massive armored door at the far end of the loading bay, his robes flowing behind him with a grace that seemed designed to emphasize his complete lack of concern for whether any of us followed. We did, of course, because what else was there to do? We had been bought and marked and transported to this place that smelled of expensive air and maintained surfaces, and the only choice that remained was whether to walk toward our inevitable deaths with some fragment of dignity intact, or to collapse screaming and be dragged toward them by servitors whose programming would not allow them to register our terror as anything more than inefficient behavior requiring correction. The door opened at Overseer Talon's approach, responding to some implanted authorization device that marked him as someone whose presence was expected and permitted in ways that ours would never be. And beyond it, I saw a corridor that stretched for what must have been 100 meters, lined on both sides with windows of reinforced glass that looked into chambers I could not yet make sense of. The lighting was different here, dimmer, tinged with colors that seemed wrong in ways I lacked the vocabulary to describe. Purples that hurt to look at directly, greens that made my eyes water, reds that pulsed with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. Through the windows I could see movement, shapes that my brain kept trying to classify as familiar things. Animals, plants, machines, before being forced to acknowledge that none of those categories were adequate to describe what I was actually seeing. "The collection," Overseer Talon said, gesturing at the windows with the casual pride of someone showing off property that had cost more than entire planetary economies, "represents 3 generations of House Valdrin's interest in xenobiological diversity. Lord Valthier, the current patriarch, has continued the tradition established by his grandfather, acquiring specimens from across the Segmentum Solar and beyond through various legal and extra-legal means. Some were purchased from rogue traders operating in the Coronis Expanse. Others were gifts from inquisitorial contacts whose pursuit of forbidden knowledge occasionally produces surplus specimens. A few were taken as trophies during military campaigns on worlds whose official records claimed they were subjected to complete exterminatus. The provenance is, in most cases, deliberately obscured, because even noble privilege has limits when it comes to the ownership of xenofauna, classified as existential threats to human survival. What matters for your purposes is not where they came from, but how to keep them alive and contained long enough that they do not kill you, kill the household, or kill everyone within a radius measured in kilometers. Your primary responsibility is feeding schedules, habitat maintenance, and emergency response protocols when containment systems fail. Your secondary responsibility is not dying in ways that damage the specimens or create excessive cleanup costs. Your tertiary responsibility is maintaining documentation of creature behavior patterns that might prove useful for academic study or military application. Any questions? The same woman from the cargo hauler, the one with the augmetic hand, finally spoke, her voice rough from years of breathing industrial fumes and swallowing the wrong questions. "What kind of creatures?" she asked, and I could hear in those 4 words the same desperate hope I felt, the hope that maybe the reality would be less horrific than what our imaginations had been constructing during this entire conversation. Overseer Talon smiled, and it was not a reassuring expression. "Everything," he said simply. Catachan fauna, whose evolutionary arms race has produced lethality beyond most weapons development programs. Psychic xenoforms that bond empathically with their handlers in ways that typically prove fatal when the handler dies. shape changers whose adaptive camouflage extends to molecular-level mimicry of human tissue, parasitic organisms that control neural function through spinal attachment, creatures whose very existence represents violations of approximately 1,700 distinct regulations in the Codex Xenologia, each violation carrying a penalty of death by burning for anyone caught possessing such specimens. You will be working with all of them. Those of you who survive the first month will receive more detailed instruction on specific handling protocols. Those of you who do not survive will be mourned by no one, because the families who sold you to the lottery were given legal documentation absolving them of all future responsibility for your welfare or remains. Welcome to House Valdrin's menagerie. Try not to scream when you die. The sound disturbs the more sensitive specimens and makes them agitated, which causes problems for whoever has to clean up afterwards. He led us deeper into the corridor, stopping at windows one by one to provide brief summaries of the horrors contained behind the reinforced glass. And with each stop, I felt something inside me die by increments. Some naive fragment of hope or innocence that had somehow survived 16 years in the middle hive, but could not withstand the clinical description of creatures designed by malevolent nature or darker forces to transform human beings into various states of dead or worse than dead. The first window showed what appeared to be large cats, the orange fur and blue eyes almost comforting in their familiarity, until Overseer Talon explained they were Gearinks, psychic empaths that bonded mentally with their owners and took on their moral characteristics in ways that could transform a benign companion into a malevolent predator, depending on whose consciousness they absorbed. Lady Valdrin's breeding pair, he said, pointing at two specimens that seemed to be watching us with intelligence I found profoundly disturbing. Their names are Silence and Hunger, which tells you everything you need to know about their current temperamental disposition. They have killed 3 handlers in the past year, 2 by psychic assault that caused catastrophic neurological failure, 1 by more traditional means involving claws and throat tearing. Do not attempt to pet them. Do not make prolonged eye contact. Do not think threatening thoughts in their presence, because they will know and they will respond accordingly. The second window contained what looked like a jungle habitat recreation, dense vegetation and artificial moisture systems creating an environment that my hive-bred senses found almost physically painful in its organic excess, and moving through that false jungle I could see shapes that made my mouth go dry with instinctive terror, multi-limbed things with carapaces that gleamed like polished metal and mandibles that could have crushed a human skull like overripe fruit. Catachan devils, Overseer Talon said with the same casual tone he might have used to describe furniture. Apex predators from one of the Imperium's death worlds, capable of destroying armored vehicles through sustained assault and possessing intelligence sufficient to coordinate pack tactics against defended positions. These are juveniles, only 3 meters in length, but they grow to twice that size in maturity. Young Master Valdrin likes to feed them live prey from the underhive, which creates certain logistical challenges when the prey proves resourceful enough to reach the ventilation systems before being caught. Last month, we lost 2 servants to that particular complication, though technically they died during recapture operations rather than during the actual feeding. So the paperwork classified them as workplace accidents rather than creature-related casualties. A third window showed nothing but a small toad-like creature sitting motionless on a rock in the center of an otherwise empty chamber, and I might have dismissed it as harmless if not for the way Overseer Talon's voice changed when he gestured toward it, taking on a quality I had not heard before, something that might have been actual fear bleeding through his professional detachment. "The great barking toad," he said quietly, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the thing even through the reinforced glass and force field generators I could now see embedded in the window frame. Sir, Catachanus bufo moribundus, the single most toxic organism currently known to Imperial xenobiology. When startled or threatened, it undergoes catastrophic biological failure that releases a toxin cloud capable of killing everything within 1,000 meters in every direction. The toxin is so virulent that no form of armor or sealed environment suit provides protection. It penetrates power armor. It dissolves ceramite. It reduces biological tissue to undifferentiated protein slurry within 90 seconds of exposure. The creature itself dies in the process, of course, but given that its defense mechanism has a 100% fatality rate for everything in range, the evolutionary logic is sound. Lord Valthier acquired this specimen at considerable cost from a rogue trader who claimed to have found it in stasis on a derelict ship from the dark age of technology, which suggests either remarkably sophisticated xenobiological research from that era, or the rogue trader was lying about provenance to justify the price. Either way, we have it now, and your responsibility is to ensure that absolutely nothing disturbs it. Habitat maintenance is performed by remote systems. No physical entry is permitted under any circumstances. If those systems fail, the entire wing evacuates and we seal the containment chamber until the specimen expires from natural causes, however long that takes. The previous estimate was 300 years, based on observed metabolic rates. Any questions? I wanted to ask why anyone would keep such a creature. What possible justification could exist for housing an organism whose only noteworthy characteristic was its ability to kill everyone nearby, including itself? But the words died in my throat because I already knew the answer. Because they could. Because possession of such rarities was itself a form of power, a demonstration that the rules governing ordinary humans did not apply to those whose wealth and status placed them beyond consequence. Because Lord Valthier and his family found the danger exciting in whatever bored and decadent way that people who had never experienced real threat might find excitement in the proximity of apocalyptic risk. Because the Imperium of man, for all its propaganda about unity and duty and service to the Emperor, was in fact a vast machine that transformed the suffering of billions into the comfort and entertainment of thousands. And this menagerie was simply a smaller version of that same fundamental arrangement written in teeth and toxins instead of tithes and taxation. We continued down the corridor, Overseer Talon pointing out additional horrors with the practiced efficiency of someone who had given this tour many times before and anticipated most questions before they were asked. Amble juveniles in a reinforced habitat, their iron-hard carapaces already showing signs of the tunneling behavior that made them capable of burrowing through solid rock and ship hulls with equal ease. A slith in a maximum security cell, the four-armed Xenos mercenary that should have been serving Chaos warlords or Dark Eldar slavers, watching us with reptilian eyes that communicated intelligence and malice in equal measure. Katashan brainleaf trees in an isolated biosphere, their tendrils swaying with movements that suggested hunger rather than response to air currents. The spinal attachment nodes that would let them take control of a human nervous system clearly visible even from outside the habitat. Blood wasps from various death worlds, their hive structures hanging from artificial ceiling supports like malevolent chandeliers constructed from insect architecture and barely suppressed hostility toward anything that moved within stinging range. And finally, Overseer Talon said, stopping before the last window in the corridor, our most recent acquisition, delivered just last month by an inquisitorial contact whose identity I am not authorized to share and whose methods of acquisition I am not authorized to question. You're looking at a first-generation Genestealer hybrid, weakened but not neutralized, contained behind triple redundant force fields and enough blessed unguents and prayer seals to supply a minor cathedral. I will not insult your intelligence by explaining why this specimen represents a threat several magnitudes beyond anything else in the collection. You have all heard the stories about Genestealer cults, the whispered warnings about hive worlds falling to alien infiltration that begins with a single organism and ends with entire populations transformed into hybrid armies awaiting the arrival of the hive fleets. What you may not fully comprehend is that this creature, if it escaped, could theoretically initiate a cult infestation that would consume Hive Tertius within 50 years and spread to adjacent hive cities within another 50. The fact that Lord Valthier keeps it here, above the heads of 12 million humans who are entirely unaware of its existence, should tell you everything you need to know about how seriously the nobility takes the welfare of those beneath them. Your responsibility regarding this specimen is minimal. You will not enter its chamber. You will not attempt communication. You will not make physical contact under any circumstances. If it breaches containment, you will activate the emergency protocols that seal this entire wing and await instructions from superiors who will likely be evacuating to off-world locations, while you die slowly from genetic infection or quickly from lass fire if the household guard decides that preventing cult spread takes priority over preserving servant lives. Understood? We all nodded, because what else were we going to do? We were standing in a corridor lined with windows that looked into chambers containing our deaths arranged in various creative formats, our lives already spent by the lottery that had brought us here, and the only remaining question was which method of dying we would eventually experience. Overseer Talon seemed satisfied with our silent compliance. "Good," he said. "You will be divided into 3 shifts operating continuously to maintain the collection. Your quarters are in the sub-levels below this wing, small but functional, equipped with basic amenities and emergency medical supplies that will prove entirely inadequate for most of the injuries you are likely to sustain. Your training supervisor is Headkeeper Vornius, who will teach you everything you need to know to survive your first week. He has been in this position for 8 years, which makes him our longest surviving employee in menagerie operations. He is missing his left arm, his right eye, and several square meters of skin across his back and shoulders, all losses sustained in the line of duty. He is also bitter, paranoid, and prone to describing in graphic detail exactly how each of his predecessors died, which I am told provides valuable lessons in pattern recognition and threat assessment. You will listen to everything he says, you will follow every instruction he gives, and you will not question his methods even when they seem excessively cautious or unnecessarily cruel. He has survived 8 years in a position where most people die within 8 weeks. His judgment has proven more reliable than any training manual or safety protocol. Questions? Nobody had questions. We followed Overseer Talon to the servant lift that would take us to our quarters, descended through the spire levels in silence that had the quality of shock, and emerged into a corridor that was still far cleaner and better maintained than anywhere I had lived before, but felt like a tomb compared to the gilded excess of the upper levels. The quarters were as promised, small rooms with cots and storage lockers and shared washing facilities that could accommodate perhaps 15 people at once. If we were willing to sacrifice personal space for efficiency, I claimed a cot in the corner of one room as far from the door as possible, operating on instincts developed in the middle hive, where corner positions meant you could only be attacked from 2 directions instead of 4. The woman with the augmetic hand took the cot next to mine, and when I looked at her, I saw the same calculation in her eyes, the same desperate attempt to find some angle that might improve our odds, even though we both knew that 8 years of survival was the absolute ceiling of what we could hope for, and most of us would not make it past 8 weeks. "Jan," she said, extending her mechanical hand in a gesture that seemed absurdly formal given our circumstances. I took it, feeling the cold metal against my palm, the subtle vibration of the mechanisms that controlled the fingers. "Malric," I said, giving her the name my mother had chosen from the list of approved designations in the administratum records, thinking even then how strange it was to be introducing ourselves when we would probably both be dead within a month. "You have children?" she asked, and I shook my head. "Mother sold me young," I said. "You?" "3. she said, her voice flat in the way that meant she was working very hard not to feel anything about what she had just revealed, all under 6 standard years. Won't remember me in a year. Better that way. We sat in silence after that, 2 people who had been marked for death by a lottery system designed to provide disposable labor for nobility who treated human life as a slightly more expensive form of servitor. Programming, and I found myself thinking about those 300 thrones my mother had received, wondering if she had already spent them on food for my siblings or if she had saved them for emergencies that might never come, because everyone in the middle hive was always 3 skipped shifts away from starvation, and the only difference was how quickly the end came, when it came. The door opened without warning and a man entered, or what remained of a man after years of proximity to things that should not exist anywhere near human habitation. He was perhaps 40 standard years, though the scars made age difficult to assess with any precision, his left arm ending in a crude augmetic that appeared to have been installed without much concern for aesthetic considerations. Just a basic mechanical limb that served functional purposes without any of the refinement that marked expensive prosthetics. His right eye was covered by a patch that might have been medical or might have been decorative concealment of damage too disturbing to display, and when he spoke, his voice had the rough quality of someone who had breathed too much toxic air and screamed too many warnings that nobody heeded. "I am head keeper Vornius," he said without preamble or introduction beyond the obvious identification. "In approximately 15 seconds, 3 of you are going to ask me questions that I have heard from every previous group of lottery winners, and I will answer them now to save time. Yes, the mortality rate Overseer Talon cited is accurate. No, there is no possibility of transfer to other duties or early termination of service contracts. Yes, the creatures are as dangerous as described, and many are more dangerous than you currently understand, because fear requires imagination, and most of you lack sufficient context to imagine properly. No, Lord Valthier will not consider changing the security protocols or disposal procedures, regardless of how many keepers die or how much suffering is involved in those deaths. Yes, I am missing body parts, and yes, each loss was preventable if I had been slightly faster, or slightly smarter, or slightly luckier. Any questions?" A young man near the back, the one with wire thief tattoos on his knuckles, raised his hand with the kind of stupid courage that marked him as someone who had not yet fully internalized his situation. "Why do you stay?" he asked, and Vornius turned to look at him with an expression that might have been amusement or might have been the kind of resignation that came from answering this same question too many times. "Because there is nowhere to go," Vornius said flatly. "The lottery contracts are legally binding until death, and attempting to break them is classified as theft of noble property, which carries a penalty of servitorization, because even if I could escape, I am marked now with the House Valdrin sigil tattooed into my forearm and branded across my back in places where it cannot be removed without excision of muscle tissue. Because I have been working with xenofauna for 8 years and have absorbed enough exotic toxins and parasitic organisms that my blood would probably fail every medical scan from here to the outer reaches. Because I am good at this work in the way that the few who survive are good at it, and whatever small pride remains in me takes satisfaction in being one of the rare ones who learn to anticipate and adapt and endure. Because dying here, working with creatures that terrify me daily, is still better than dying in a manufactorum producing ammunition that will be used in wars I will never understand by soldiers who consider people like us as expendable as the bullets they fire. Any other questions? Nobody else raised a hand, and Vornius nodded as if this pleased him. "Good," he said. "We start tomorrow. You will be assigned to different shifts and different chambers based on assessments I will make during your first week of supervised work. Some of you will die during that first week. That is expected and has been factored into the staffing calculations that determine when to run another lottery. Those who survive will be given gradually increased responsibilities until you either prove competent or prove dead. Tonight you sleep. Tomorrow you begin learning what it means to serve at the pleasure of nobility, who collect nightmares the way other people collect art. Get rest if you can. Your last comfortable sleep ended when you got on that cargo hauler. Everything after this is borrowed time. He left without further ceremony, the door hissing shut behind him, and in the silence that followed, I heard someone crying softly in one of the other rooms. The sound muffled but unmistakable, the sound of someone who had just fully comprehended what they had volunteered for when they put their names in the lottery pool. I did not cry, not then and not later, because crying required the belief that someone might care about your tears, might respond to your suffering with something other than professional assessment of whether you remained functionally capable of performing assigned duties. I lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling, which was clean white plasteel instead of the rust-stained metal I had slept beneath for 16 hours, and I thought about those 300 thrones and how my mother had probably made the right choice, because at least my siblings would eat for a few more months, and eating for a few more months was the highest ambition any of us could reasonably claim. Sleep came eventually, broken and fitful, filled with dreams where I walked through corridors lined with windows that looked into chambers containing versions of myself in various states of dismemberment and dissolution, each one marked with the date of their death written in the bioluminescent script that certain deep hive fungi used to mark territory boundaries. In the dream, I stopped to read each date, cataloging them in the methodical way I'd once cataloged work shifts and food ration schedules. And I realized that the dates formed a pattern, a countdown that ended exactly 93 days after my arrival, which aligned precisely with the statistical probability that Overseer Talon had cited for keeper mortality in the first 6 months. I woke before the countdown finished. Woke to the sound of someone knocking on the door with mechanical rhythm that suggested servitor programming or human behavior that had been reduced to functionally similar patterns. And when I opened my eyes, I saw that the light in the corridor had changed from the soft amber of rest period to the harsh white of work cycle activation. The knocking stopped when I sat up, replaced by Vornius's voice calling through the door that we had 30 minutes to prepare for our first shift. 30 minutes to perform whatever morning rituals we felt were necessary before beginning the work that would define the remainder of our rapidly abbreviated lives. I washed in the communal facilities, sharing space with the other lottery winners, all of us silent with the kind of silence that came from having nothing left to say that would not sound like goodbye. Jan was there, her augmetic hand moving through the motions of cleaning with mechanical precision, and when she caught my eye, she nodded once, a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or might have been the kind of resigned greeting you gave to someone you expected to be dead soon. I nodded back, and we finished washing without further communication because words seemed inadequate and possibly dangerous, as if speaking our fears aloud might make them more real than they already were. Vornius was waiting in the corridor when we emerged, his single organic eye scanning across us with the practiced assessment of someone who had learned to identify weakness and strength at a glance, to sort the potentially competent from the definitely doomed. You, he said, pointing at Jan with his augmetic hand. You have manufacturing experience. Judging by the prosthetic and the calluses on your remaining hand, you will be assigned to mechanical system maintenance and habitat fabrication oversight. You, he said, pointing at the wire thief, will be assigned to food preparation and feeding schedules, because anyone capable of stealing copper from powered conduits has at least basic understanding of risk assessment and quick extraction. You, he said, pointing at me, will be assigned to direct creature care and behavioral observation, because you have the eyes of someone who has learned to watch for danger without being told to look. The rest of you will be sorted over the next few days based on how you respond to initial exposure and whether you can follow instructions without requiring repetition or physical discipline. We followed him back to the menagerie wing, back through the corridor lined with windows that looked into chambers I had hoped might seem less terrifying in daylight, but instead seemed worse because the improved lighting revealed details I had missed during yesterday's tour. Revealed the bloodstains on habitat walls that no amount of cleaning could fully remove. Revealed the scratch marks where previous creatures or previous keepers had tried desperately to escape their respective confinements and failed. Vornius stopped at the first window, the one showing the Gearing's pair, and turned to address me specifically. "These are Lady Valdrin's prized specimens," he said, his voice taking on the careful neutrality of someone describing something that had personally harmed him and might do so again. Silence and Hunger are their names, chosen by Lady Valdrin herself after they developed behavioral patterns that apparently reminded her of abstract philosophical concepts she encountered during her education at the Schola Progenium. They are psychic empaths, which means they sense emotions and thought patterns with clarity that most humans cannot achieve even with sophisticated augmetic enhancement. They have killed 3 of my previous trainees, 2 through direct psychic assault that caused brain hemorrhaging, 1 through traditional predatory behavior involving throat trauma. You will enter their habitat exactly once per day to provide fresh food and clean water. You will not attempt to touch them. You will not think aggressive thoughts in their presence. You will not show fear because they interpret fear as weakness and weakness as invitation. You will approach their feeding station, deposit the prepared meat, exit immediately. The entire process should take no longer than 90 seconds. Any longer and you risk triggering their hunting response. Any shorter and they will suspect you are attempting to poison them, which they will interpret as threat requiring elimination. Do you understand these instructions? I nodded, because speaking seemed dangerous. Seemed like it might reveal the absolute terror that was currently making my hands shake and my stomach clench with the certainty that I was being sent into a chamber with creatures that could kill me through force of hostile thought alone. Vornius noticed my shaking hands, and something that might have been sympathy flickered across his scarred face. "Everyone is afraid their first time," he said quietly. "The ones who claim they are not afraid are lying or stupid, and both categories die faster than the honest cowards. Fear keeps you alive as long as it makes you cautious rather than paralyzed. The Gearings can sense your fear, but they also sense whether that fear is paired with aggression or submission. Be afraid, but submissive. Be terrified, but deferential. Show them through your thoughts that you recognize their superiority and have no intention of challenging their status. That is how you survive the first approach. After that, each subsequent approach becomes slightly easier until the day when it becomes routine enough that you make a mistake. That is when they kill you. I've been entering their habitat for 8 years, and I still treat every interaction as potentially fatal. Learned that lesson faster than my previous trainees did. He opened the habitat access door using authorization codes entered into a keypad that looked newer than the surrounding architecture, suggesting that previous access protocols had been compromised in ways that required complete system replacement. Inside, the habitat was larger than it had appeared through the window, a constructed environment that mimicked natural landscape in ways that must have cost more than my family's combined earnings over multiple generations. The floor was covered in something that looked and felt like real grass, imported from agri-worlds where vegetation that soft was common enough to waste on decoration. The air was temperature controlled to exactly the standards that Gearings preferred. Warm but not hot, humid but not oppressive, carrying scents that my hive-bred senses found almost painfully organic. Growing things, living earth, the complex chemical signals that plants use to communicate with each other in ecosystems I'd only read about in educational material designed for children in the middle hive schools. The Gearings themselves were lying on a platform constructed from what appeared to be actual wood, not recycled biomass, but genuine timber harvested from trees and shaped by craftsmen who understood how to work with organic materials, and when they saw me enter, they raised their heads with the synchronized precision of predators who had hunted together for long enough that their movements had achieved unconscious coordination. Their eyes were blue, exactly as the propaganda images had suggested, but the blue was not the soft, friendly blue of sky or water, but the electric blue of plasma discharge, the warning blue of radiation hazards, the blue that meant danger in every context where humans had learned to associate colors with threat assessment. They watched me with those terrible blue eyes as I crossed the habitat toward their feeding station, and I could feel something pressing against my thoughts, a presence that was not quite voice and not quite touch, but somehow both at once. An intrusion into my consciousness that felt like fingers made of thought reaching through my skull to examine the contents of my brain. I remembered Vornius's advice and tried very hard not to think about how much I wanted to run, how every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to drop the food container and escape back through the access door before these creatures decided that I was more interesting as prey than as servant. Instead, I thought about submission, about my own inadequacy, about how small and weak I was compared to their psychic power and predatory capability, and I felt the mental pressure shift slightly, the examination becoming less hostile and more curious, as if the Gearinks had expected aggression or fear alone and were somehow intrigued by this different emotional signature. I reached the feeding station, deposited the prepared meat, fresh, not the recycled protein that I had eaten all my life, but actual flesh from actual animals slaughtered specifically to feed these exotic pets, and stepped back slowly, carefully, keeping my movements smooth and unthreatening. The Gearinks continued to watch me, their tails swishing with movements that could have been contentment or could have been anticipation of violence, and I tried very hard not to speculate about which interpretation was correct, because speculation felt too much like forming aggressive intentions, and aggressive intentions felt like exactly the kind of thought that would trigger their hunting response. I made it back to the access door without incident, exited the habitat, and heard the door seal behind me with a hiss of equalizing pressure that felt like the sound of temporary salvation. Vornius was waiting outside, his expression suggesting neither approval nor disappointment, but rather the clinical assessment of someone who had just witnessed predictable behavior following expected patterns. 97 seconds, he said, checking a chronometer built into his augmetic arm. 7 seconds over optimal time, but well within acceptable parameters for first attempt. The Gearinks were curious about you, which is better than immediate hostility, but potentially more dangerous in the long term. Curiosity means they will pay attention to you during future interactions, will remember your presence and your behavior patterns. If those patterns remain consistent, you will probably survive. If they change, if you enter their habitat one day with different emotional state or altered thought processes, they will notice and they will interpret those changes as potential threat. Consistency is your only defense against psychic predators. Remember that. We moved on to other habitats, other creatures, and with each chamber, Vornius provided the same detailed instructions delivered in the same flat affect, teaching me the protocols that would keep me alive for days or weeks or months until the day when I made a mistake, or the protocols proved insufficient, or the creatures simply decided that they preferred violence over routine. I learned how to approach the Keteshan devil habitat from angles that minimized exposure to their primary sensory organs, how to deliver food at temperatures and presentation styles that satisfied their instinctive preferences without triggering aggressive feeding behavior that might extend to include attacking the keeper. I learned the emergency evacuation routes from every chamber, memorized the locations of panic buttons and emergency response systems that would seal compromised habitats and protect the rest of the menagerie, even if it meant abandoning whoever was trapped inside to whatever fate awaited them. I learned to recognize the signs of impending containment failure. Unusual sounds in the force field generators, temperature fluctuations that suggested climate control malfunctions, behavioral changes in specimens that indicated stress, or illness that might make them more dangerous than baseline lethality. The days blurred together after that first week, became a rhythm of feeding schedules and cleaning protocols and constant vigilance that never quite achieved routine, because routine implied safety, and safety was a concept that did not exist in proximity to creatures that could kill you through thought or touch or simple proximity. I watched 3 of my fellow lottery winners die during those first weeks. The wire thief was killed by a Catachan's devil when he moved too quickly during a feeding and triggered the creature's chase response, dying in approximately 6 seconds from trauma that left his body in pieces too small for conventional burial. A woman whose name I never learned was psychically assaulted by the Gearigs when she entered their habitat while experiencing anger at some unrelated frustration, her brain hemorrhaging so catastrophically that she was dead before she hit the grass-covered floor. Another man simply vanished one day, disappeared from the menagerie wing with no trace except blood traces found in the slith's chamber, and the creature's satisfied posture suggesting recent feeding, though official records classified his death as desertion rather than creature-related casualty, because acknowledging the latter would require explaining why a Xenos mercenary species was being kept in a noble collection rather than being immediately reported to inquisitorial authorities. I survived those first weeks through obsessive adherence to the protocols Vornius taught me, through paranoid attention to every detail of creature behavior and habitat status, through the kind of hypervigilance that made sleep difficult and relaxation impossible, but kept me alive when faster or stronger or smarter people died because they made single mistakes in environments where single mistakes were invariably fatal. I learned to read the Gyrink's moods from subtle changes in their posture and tail position, learned to anticipate the Catachan devil feeding patterns by tracking lunar cycles that influenced their aggression levels, even in artificial environments. Light years from their native world, I learned that the Amble juveniles were slowly tunneling through their habitat walls, despite supposedly impenetrable containment, their iron-hard carapaces grinding through reinforced plasteel at rates measured in millimeters per week, but cumulative over months in ways that suggested eventual breach was certain, rather than merely possible. I reported this observation to Vornius, who reported it to Overseer Tallinn, who apparently reported it to Lord Valthier, because 2 weeks later I was summoned to the upper levels to provide direct testimony about my findings in the presence of nobility who treated my report as entertainment rather than emergency. I stood in a receiving chamber that was larger and more opulent than anything I had imagined could exist. Walls covered in tapestries that depicted historical events from perspectives that made imperial victories seem even more glorious than propaganda suggested. Floors made from marble, imported from quarries on worlds I could not locate on any chart, furniture constructed from materials whose names I did not know and whose craftsmanship suggested lifetimes of specialized labor dedicated to single pieces. Lord Valthier himself was present, a man in perhaps his 5th decade who wore his wealth and status like armor, his clothes more expensive than most HAB units, his augmetic enhancements subtle but clearly superior to anything available to common citizens, his entire presentation designed to communicate absolute certainty in his own superiority. "You are the keeper who identified the Amble tunneling behavior," he said, his voice carrying the educated accent that marked him as someone who had been taught by private tutors and had never needed to raise his volume to be heard over industrial noise or crowd sounds. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady in the presence of someone who could order my death as casually as he might order refreshments. "Fascinating," Lord Valthier continued, turning to address the other nobles gathered in the chamber with him, men and women who wore similar expressions of bored interest, treating this report the same way they might treat a performance or demonstration arranged for their amusement. The creatures demonstrate tool-using behavior adapted to artificial environments, despite being juveniles with presumably limited exposure to anything beyond natural cave systems. This suggests either remarkable cognitive flexibility or instinctive behaviors so deeply programmed that they require no learning period. Either explanation has interesting implications for potential military application. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Keeper. You may return to your duties. He dismissed me with a gesture that made clear my presence was no longer required or desired, and I escaped back to the menagerie wing with the understanding that my report had been noted but would result in no changes to containment protocols, no emergency repairs to habitat structures, no acknowledgement that the slow breach I had identified represented actual danger rather than merely interesting behavioral data for academic study. The amble continued their tunneling, the walls continued to thin, and I continued to perform my daily duties, knowing that eventually those creatures would break through to freedom, and whoever was working near their habitat at that moment would have perhaps 10 seconds to evacuate before being torn apart by iron-clawed predators that could burrow through battle tank armor. 3 months passed. 6 months. I survived longer than the 93-day average overseer Talon had cited. Survived through combination of fear and caution, and the kind of desperate attention to detail that came from knowing that every day might end with death in formats too numerous to catalog. Jan survived as well, her manufacturing experience translating into capability with habitat maintenance systems that kept her mostly isolated from direct creature contact. Vornius continued his 8-year streak of survival through methods that seemed to involve treating every interaction with the specimens as equally dangerous, regardless of apparent risk levels, maintaining hypervigilance that never degraded into complacency even after thousands of successful feeding cycles. We became, if not friends, then something similar. 3 people bound together by shared understanding that we were marked for death, that survival was temporary gift rather than permanent condition, that the best we could hope for was to last a little longer before the creatures or the containment systems or simple bad luck finally caught up with us. Then Inquisitor Vex returned with a new acquisition, and everything got worse. He arrived without warning, as Inquisitors tended to do, his authority superseding all normal security protocols and access restrictions. His presence immediately transforming the menagerie wing from regulated workplace into potential theological nightmare. He was accompanied by 6 stormtroopers in full battle armor, their weapons trained on a containment crate that was large enough to hold a human adult and was covered in purity seals and prayer inscriptions that suggested whatever was inside required religious intervention as much as physical restraint. The crate was unloaded in the receiving bay under Vornius's direct supervision, and I watched from a safe distance as the stormtroopers handled it with the kind of exaggerated caution that marked them as people who had been briefed on exactly what kind of horror they were transporting, and had no desire to experience that horror firsthand through containment failure. "What is it?" I asked Vornius after the Inquisitor and his escort had departed, leaving behind the crate and instructions for its proper storage and care that filled 17 pages of single-spaced text in High Gothic with extensive annotations in what appeared to be multiple xenolinguistic formats. Vornius stared at the crate with an expression I'd never seen on his scarred face before. Something that might have been actual terror finally breaking through the resigned fatalism that had carried him through 8 years of proximity to nightmares. "Genestealer," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking the name too loudly might somehow wake the thing inside. First-generation hybrid, weakened but not dead, contained but not sterilized. The Inquisitor claims it has been neutralized through some combination of psychic binding and chemical suppression, which is inquisitorial terminology for "we have slowed down the inevitable catastrophe, but not prevented it." We are to house it in the maximum security chamber, maintain strict quarantine protocols, observe its behavior patterns for research purposes that were not specified in any detail. We are also to report immediately any signs of genetic infection among staff or household members, which is bureaucratic code for if this thing infects you, we will burn everyone in the menagerie wing to prevent cult spread. So try very hard not to get infected. We moved the crate to the maximum security chamber using remote handling systems and following decontamination protocols that would have been appropriate for handling active viral weapons, because in many ways that was exactly what we were handling. A weapon that reproduced through contact, that transformed its victims into infection vectors for the next generation, that operated on timescales measured in decades rather than days, but was no less deadly for that patience. The chamber itself was located at the far end of the menagerie wing, isolated from other habitats by multiple layers of reinforced walls and emergency containment systems that could seal the entire section in event of breach. The crate was positioned in the center of the chamber and opened by remote manipulation, revealing a creature that made everything else in the collection seem almost benign by comparison. It was humanoid in the way that nightmares are humanoid, possessing enough human characteristics that my brain kept trying to classify it as a person before being forced to acknowledge that whatever had been human about its ancestry had been so thoroughly transformed by Xenos genetics that the result was something new and terrible. It had 4 arms, the upper pair ending in hands that possessed too many fingers with too many joints, the lower pair terminating in claws that looked like they belonged on a creature designed for tunneling through earth and flesh with equal efficiency. Its skin was purple-gray, chitinous in places and smooth in others, marked with patterns that my eyes could not quite focus on, as if my visual cortex was rejecting the data as fundamentally incompatible with baseline human perception. Its eyes were the worst part, human-shaped but filled with something that was not human consciousness, looking at me with intelligence that promised understanding, followed by genetic dissolution and eventual transformation into something like itself. The creature did not move when the crate opened, did not rush toward the chamber walls in desperate escape attempt, but I could see its muscles tensing in ways that suggested it was assessing its environment, cataloging weaknesses, calculating optimal approaches for eventual breach. "It's been weakened," Vornius said, though his voice suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as inform me. The Inquisitor used some combination of chemical agents and psychic binding to suppress its aggressive responses and slow its metabolic processes. According to the documentation, it should remain in this reduced state for approximately 6 months before its adaptive biology begins to metabolize the suppression agents and restore normal function. At that point, we are supposed to apply additional suppressants following protocols that the Inquisitor will provide before that deadline. Assuming he remembers, assuming he survives whatever mission he is currently undertaking. Assuming nothing goes wrong in the next 6 months that might trigger early metabolic response. "What happens if something does go wrong?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from the way Vornius was looking at the creature with something approaching despair. "Everyone in the menagerie wing dies from infection or from cleansing fire. Everyone in the spire levels who had contact with menagerie staff gets evaluated for genetic corruption and probably executed as precautionary measure. And we all get remembered as the idiots who let a genestealer cult begin its infestation sequence in the heart of Hive Tertius's noble spires. That is what happens if something goes wrong. So nothing is allowed to go wrong. You will check this containment chamber daily. You will verify force field integrity, environmental system function, prey seal activation, and report any anomalies immediately regardless of how minor they seem. You will not enter this chamber. You will not attempt communication with the specimen. You will treat every interaction as if you are standing next to an unexploded melter bomb that might detonate at any moment for reasons that have nothing to do with your actions and everything to do with fundamental instability in its construction. Do you understand these instructions?" I understood. I understood that we were all doomed, that the presence of this creature in the collection had transformed a dangerous job into a suicidal one, that Lord Valthier's collection had finally crossed some line from expensive hobby into existential threat to millions of humans who were completely unaware that their lives depended on the continued functionality of containment systems maintained by lottery winners who had been selected specifically for their disposability. I performed my daily checks on the Genestealer chamber with the kind of obsessive attention that made my other duties seem almost casual by comparison. Verifying every system twice and then verifying again, looking for any signs that the creature's condition was changing, that its weakened state was transitioning toward active functionality. For 3 weeks, it remained motionless, its breathing so slow that sometimes I thought it might have died during the night, and I would arrive to find a corpse rather than a contained horror. But each morning it was still alive, still watching me with those terrible, not quite human eyes, still calculating something I could not guess but knew involved my eventual death. Then the power failed. It was a brief failure, lasting perhaps 10 seconds, caused by the amble breach that had finally happened after months of slow tunneling, the creatures breaking through their habitat wall into an adjacent power junction and damaging systems that controlled multiple chambers. Simultaneously, emergency generators activated before most habitats experienced critical failure. But 10 seconds was enough for the Genestealer's chamber to experience temporary force field collapse. Enough time for the creature to test its restraints and discover they were no longer fully operational. It did not escape during those 10 seconds. The triple redundant containment meant that even with one system offline, the other two remained functional. But when I arrived for my daily check, I could see immediately that something had changed. The creature was standing now instead of crouching, its posture suggesting alertness that had not been present before. And when it looked at me, I felt something press against my mind, with the same intrusive presence I had experienced with the Gyrinx, but darker, more predatory, carrying with that mental touch a promise of transformation rather than mere death. I reported the change to Vornius, who reported it to Overseer Talon, who reported it to Lord Valthier, and the response was exactly what I had feared. Fascination rather than alarm, entertainment rather than emergency action. "Excellent," Lord Valthier said when he arrived to observe the specimen personally, bringing with him an entourage of other nobles who treated the situation as opportunity for exotic viewing experience. "The creature is adapting faster than expected. This provides valuable data on Genestealer resilience and metabolic flexibility. Continue monitoring, but do not increase security measures. I want to see how it responds to environmental stimuli over the next few weeks. This could provide insights useful for military applications or Xenos research." I stood in the observation room watching the nobility observe the creature observe them, and I realized with absolute clarity that they would continue this grotesque collection until catastrophe could no longer be contained or ignored. That Lord Valthier's boredom and curiosity would eventually kill everyone in the spire and probably everyone in the hive levels below, and that my responsibility was not just to myself, but to the 12 million humans who did not know they were living beneath a menagerie of horrors maintained by a noble who treated apocalyptic risk as personal entertainment. This could not continue. Something had to change. The question was whether I possessed the courage or the desperation to be the one who initiated that change. I found Vornius in the Keeper quarters that night. Found him sitting alone in the common area with a bottle of recaf that had been brewed strong enough to qualify as chemical weapon. His single organic eye staring at the wall with the blank affect of someone who had seen too much and stopped trying to process it all in anything approaching healthy cognitive function. "We need to talk," I said, and something in my voice must have communicated the seriousness of what I was about to propose, because Vornius looked at me with sudden focus, the resignation dropping away to reveal desperate attention. "I think we both know this cannot continue," I said quietly. glancing around to make sure we were alone and the servitors were not within hearing range. The Genestealer is waking up. The Amble have breached containment once and will do so again. The Girinks are becoming more aggressive with each passing month. The entire collection is a catastrophe waiting for optimal moment to occur, and Lord Valthier treats it as ongoing entertainment rather than imminent threat. How many more lottery winners die before someone acknowledges this is insane? How many more breaches before something escapes and kills everyone in the spire? How long before the Genestealer infects someone and we have a cult infestation growing beneath the surface of Hive Tertius? Vornius did not respond immediately, and for a moment I thought I had miscalculated, thought he was going to report me to Overseer Talon for seditious thinking or dangerous speculation. But then he spoke, his voice so quiet I had to lean closer to hear him. "I have been planning this for 2 years," he said, each word measured and careful. "Not escape. Escape is impossible, but ending. Ending it all. The collection, the household, the entire grotesque display that treats our lives as expendable resources. For noble amusement, I have mapped every containment system, identified every failure point, calculated exactly how to trigger simultaneous breaches that would overwhelm emergency protocols and allow the creatures to reach the noble quarters before guards could establish effective defensive perimeter. I have not acted because acting requires certainty that dying alongside the nobility who enslaved us is preferable to surviving in continued servitude, and that certainty has been difficult to maintain when survival instinct argues for endurance over dramatic gesture. But you are right. This cannot continue. The Genestealer makes it inevitable. Either we end this now, while we can still control how it ends, or it ends later, when the Genestealer cult transforms Hive Tertius into horror that requires inquisitorial intervention and probably exterminatus. Better to die choosing our own destruction than to live facilitating theirs. He detailed his plan with the clinical precision of someone who had thought about this for years, who had calculated every angle and contingency and failure point. The noble household was hosting a grand celebration in 3 days, commemorating 40 years of House Valdrin's menagerie operations, with every major noble family from Hive Tertius invited to attend and observe the collection. Security would be focused on the noble quarters, assuming threats would come from outside rather than from within. We would use that assumption against them during the celebration while the nobles were gathered for viewing presentations in the grand ballroom adjacent to the menagerie wing. We would systematically disable containment systems, starting with smaller creatures and building toward catastrophic failure. The Catachan devils would be released first, their attack causing initial chaos. Then the Amble, already close to breaking through their habitat walls, would be given final access to adjacent chambers. The brainleaf spores would be released through the ventilation systems. The Girinks would sense the violence and respond with psychic assault against minds already panicked and vulnerable. And finally, when everything else had failed to kill the assembled nobility, or they were attempting organized evacuation, the Genestealer would be released into crowds that included wounded and desperate humans, perfect for infection vectors that would seed cult growth throughout survivors. "And the barking toad?" I asked, because that seemed like the logical conclusion to a plan designed to ensure total destruction. Vornius smiled, and it was the most terrible expression I'd ever seen on a human face, combining satisfaction and resignation and something approaching peace. "The barking toad will be disturbed during the chaos," he said calmly. "Someone will shoot near its chamber, or a released creature will bump into its habitat, or the power fluctuations will trigger enough vibration to startle it, and when it detonates, everyone within 1 kilometer dies. The entire spire section, all the nobles, all the guards, all the servants and slaves and lottery winners who sold themselves into service, thinking it was better than dying in manufactorums. Everyone, including us. But at least the collection will die with us. And Lord Valtier will finally understand that some collections should never have been assembled. I should have refused. I should have reported him to Overseer Tallinn and accepted whatever punishment came from association with seditious planning. But I did not refuse because he was right. This could not continue, and if the price of ending it was my own death alongside everyone else in the Spire section, then that seemed like fair trade for preventing the alternative future where Genestealer cult grew beneath the notice of authorities until it reached critical mass and condemned the entire hive to either cult transformation or imperial purging fire. I agreed to help, agreed to participate in systematic destruction of the containment systems I had been maintaining for months, and I felt something inside me die with that agreement. Some last fragment of hope or innocence that had somehow survived everything I'd experienced since the lottery, but could not survive the decision to become active agent of apocalyptic violence rather than passive victim of it. The next 3 days passed in what felt like suspended time, every moment stretched and distorted by awareness of what was coming. Every routine duty transformed into final performance of familiar tasks. I fed the Gyrinx for the last time, watching silence and hunger, watching me with those terrible blue eyes that seemed to know something had changed in my emotional state, even if they could not quite identify what that change meant. I performed my final check on the Genestealer chamber, looking at the creature that was now fully awake and testing its restraints with methodical patience. And I wondered if it sensed what we were planning, if whatever alien intelligence operated behind those not quite human eyes could detect our intentions. I helped Jan with habitat maintenance one last time, neither of us speaking about what we both knew was coming, both of us performing our duties with the desperate attention of people trying to ensure that if these were our last actions, they would at least be performed competently. The evening of the celebration arrived with all the oppressive certainty of execution date. The noble quarters above us filled with voices and music, and the sounds of luxury being consumed without thought to its cost. Hundreds of aristocrats gathering to celebrate Lord Valthier's collection and congratulate themselves on their refined appreciation of xenological diversity. Overseer Tallinn summoned all remaining keepers to provide brief testimony about specific specimens, treating us as living exhibits alongside the creatures, demonstrating to the assembled nobles how even disposable servants could be trained to articulate observations about beast behavior if given sufficient discipline and threat of punishment. I spoke for exactly 90 seconds about Gyrinx's empathic patterns, delivering information I had gathered over months of feeding cycles, and I looked out at the assembled nobility while I spoke, and I felt nothing. No anger or hatred or righteous fury, just the blank emptiness of someone who had already accepted their own death and was waiting for opportunity to implement it. When the viewing presentations concluded and the nobles gathered in the grand ballroom for formal dining and social celebration, Vornius gave the signal with subtle gesture I had been trained to recognize, and we moved into position to begin systematic destruction of systems I had been maintaining since my arrival 6 months ago. Jan accessed the central control station and began implementing code sequences that Vornius had developed over years of study. Each sequence designed to disable specific containment systems while avoiding immediate alarm triggers that would alert security forces before we achieved critical mass of simultaneous failures. I moved through the menagerie wing chamber by chamber, physically disabling backup systems and emergency protocols that might prevent complete breach. My hands, working with practiced efficiency, developed from months of routine maintenance now applied toward routine demolition. The Catechan Devil habitat was first. Force fields dropped, physical barriers retracted, and the creatures that had been contained in artificial jungle recreation suddenly found themselves free to act on predatory instincts that had been frustrated by months of confinement. They moved with terrible speed, flowing from their habitat into the corridor and then following scent trails toward the ballroom where hundreds of humans were gathered in dense concentration that must have seemed like gift from whatever gods Catechan devils worshipped. I heard the screaming start, perhaps 30 seconds after their release, heard the distinctive sounds of carnage filtered through architectural distance, human voices raised in terror and pain and desperate disbelief that their celebration had transformed into massacre. The Amble were next. The walls they had been slowly tunneling through for months finally gave way under combination of manual override and strategic weakening of final barriers, and the creatures burst through into adjacent chambers with momentum that carried them directly toward the source of chaos already developing in the ballroom. The brainleaf spores were released through ventilation systems, invisible and almost undetectable, drifting through air circulation patterns that would distribute them throughout the entire wing before anyone realized that the air they were breathing had been weaponized against them. And then I reached the Gyrink's habitat, opened the access door manually using emergency override codes that were supposed to be restricted to life-threatening emergencies, and watched silence and hunger emerge from their comfortable environment with expressions that suggested they had been waiting for exactly this moment. Their psychic senses attuned to the violence and fear now saturating the atmosphere and responding with enthusiasm that confirmed everything Vornius had told me about how these creatures took on their owners' moral characteristics. I did not watch what they did when they reached the ballroom, did not need to see it directly, because the screaming changed quality when the psychic assault began, became something more desperate and confused as minds that had spent entire lives secure in their superiority suddenly experienced direct assault on the consciousness they had assumed was inviolate. I moved on to the final releases, opening chambers and disabling systems with mechanical efficiency, letting loose predators and parasites and things that did not fit into any category that Imperial xenology recognized. The Silith escaped and immediately vanished into the architectural maze of the spire, pursuing its own agenda for freedom or revenge or whatever motivated four-armed Xenos mercenaries who had been imprisoned for noble entertainment. Lesser threats and greater horrors mixed in corridors that had never been designed for uncontrolled creature movement, creating combinations of violence and chaos that overwhelmed guard response and emergency protocols simultaneously. And then I reached the Genestealer chamber, found Vornius already there, and together we initiated the final breach. Triple redundant force fields failed in sequence. Prayer seals burned away with acrid smoke that smelled of failed faith and desperate hope. And the creature that had been contained for 3 weeks stepped through into freedom with movements that suggested it had been rehearsing this moment since its capture, planning exactly what it would do when opportunity finally presented. It looked at us with those terrible, not quite human eyes, and I felt its thoughts press against my mind with force. That might have been threat, or might have been promise, or might have been simple statement of what would happen next. Then it moved past us toward the ballroom, toward the concentration of wounded and panicked humans who represented perfect infection vectors, and I knew that we had just initiated something that would continue long after our deaths, that would spread through Hive Tertius in patterns measured in decades, and eventually require either inquisitorial intervention or complete planetary abandonment. The barking toad, Vornius said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sounds of ongoing carnage echoing through the wing. "We have 30 seconds. We ran toward the evacuation routes we had memorized, ran through corridors filled with sounds that suggested nightmare had achieved physical manifestation, ran past windows that showed chambers emptied of creatures that should never have been free. Behind us, the barking toad, disturbed by the chaos and power fluctuations and the presence of released predators near its habitat, finally experienced the level of threat that triggered its ultimate defense mechanism. The explosion, when it came, was not dramatic. No fire or force, just sudden expansion of toxin cloud that killed everything biological within calculated radius and dissolved flesh into undifferentiated protein slurry that would poison this location for years or decades or possibly centuries, depending on environmental remediation capabilities that might never be implemented. I felt it catch me as I ran, felt the toxin begin its work on tissues never designed to resist chemical assault of this sophistication and lethality, and my last thought as I fell was that maybe my mother had been wrong about the lottery. Maybe 300 thrones had not been a good deal after all. Or maybe it had been an excellent deal because I had survived 6 months longer than expected and had finally done something that mattered more than just prolonging my own survival. I had freed them. Emperor, forgive me. I had freed them all. The official reports would classify it as tragic accident, containment failure resulting from multiple systemic malfunctions, no survivors, entire spire section quarantined and eventually abandoned when decontamination proved more expensive than simply sealing the area and pretending it had never existed. The truth would remain buried in inquisitorial files, marked for restricted access, noting the Genestealer's escape and tracking subsequent cult development through the hive levels, calculating timelines for cult emergence that would require intervention within 50 years. And preparing contingency plans that ranged from targeted purging to total planetary abandonment. Other noble families would quietly dispose of their own exotic collections, suddenly understanding that some luxuries carried costs that exceeded even their considerable capacity for absorbing consequences through wealth and status. And somewhere deep in the underhive, a Gyrinx with fur that had darkened to match the hatred it had absorbed from months of proximity to cruel nobility would stalk prey with psychic senses, tuned to detecting fear and weakness, continuing its existence in new environment that appreciated its capabilities more honestly than the nobles who had kept it as decorative familiar the monsters had won. The pets had become predators, and in the vast grinding machinery of the Imperium, where trillions died in service to systems that consumed them without thought or gratitude, one small revenge had been accomplished, one minor redistribution of suffering from bottom to top. One lottery winner who had finally paid his mother back for those 300 thrones by ensuring that at least a few of the people who had treated human life as disposable resource learned firsthand what disposability actually meant.